Welcome to the Going Beyond podcast. I'm your host, Randy Zinn. I'm a mother, an author, and an entrepreneur who is committed to and curious about living a life that is always evolving. This is a lifestyle podcast covering health, both body and mind, self-care, why it is a necessity, and how tough it can be to master, entrepreneurship, its ups and downs, cultural disruption, and the topics we sometimes avoid, as well as love, sex, friendship, and more. This podcast is a place and a community for people who are willing to do the hard work of growth, who want the tools and inspiration to step into it, and who want to grow each and every day of their lives. I interview movement makers, leaders, survivors, writers, and founders. Their stories move me and will move you to cultivate more strength and clarity during every step of your day. Enjoy today's episode, and thanks for spending time with me at this very special place in my life over here at the Going Beyond podcast. If you're enjoying the Going Beyond podcast, consider subscribing so you never miss an episode. When you subscribe, our weekly episode arrives right onto your device on whichever platform you've subscribed from. We also appreciate 5-star ratings and reviews. Thanks so much for your support, friends. We're so glad you're hanging with us. Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's episode. I'm thrilled you're here. I know that today's conversation will be moving and a space for deep listening and understanding. The nature of which I come to this conversation feels very meant to be. As some of you know, I've been doing a lot of research and inviting guests onto the show. Those of you who listened to my episode with my longtime friend and first yoga teacher, Faith Hunter, you know that we went into this conversation in that episode and a few others, but I've been really leaning into questions about the wellness industry and where spaces may feel safe or not safe, where they may be diverse or not diverse, and inclusive and welcoming and comfortable for many. I'm really, really committed to exploring that and sharing it with you, my listeners. And so I just so happened to have been doing a bunch of research on the topic, and I stumbled upon a woman named Chrissy King. And we share a handful of people in common, as well as some communities. And I saw her work in fitness and wellness, and her work around women and their mindset around their physical bodies. We're going to learn all of this today when we speak to her. But I also saw that she's really consciously dove into creating very important work, courses, teachings, conversations around diversity and equity in the wellness industry. So I made note, I need to talk to Chrissy. And then all of a sudden, Eileen, who's my producer on this show, sent me a link and said, oh, guess what? I stumbled upon this woman, Chrissy King, and I hope you don't mind, but I reached out to her and I booked a conversation because I know you should talk to her. Boom. So I love when the universe works that way. So Chrissy is here with me today. I'll introduce her, but you might have just heard her giggle. So hey, Chrissy.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here with you today.
So happy you're here. I love when the universe does that, when you're just like getting to know someone on the internet and then all of a sudden they're like sitting with you for a conversation.
It's perfect how the universe works.
It really is. So I can't wait for our conversation just to be the thing that allows people to get to know you and know more about your work. But I will do a little brief intro of you. So Chrissy's a writer, a speaker, a strength coach, an educator, and her passion is creating a diverse and inclusive wellness industry. She empowers individuals to stop shrinking, start taking up space, and using their energy to create their specific magic in the world. I really love that. She's been featured in like all major wellness press, let's just call it that. And she has a degree in social justice and sociology from Marquette University. She uses her passion for social justice and fuels that with her love and commitment to fitness and empowerment. And it's just such a ripe and perfect space for that. She, again, empowers people to stop the shrinking. And just when we got into this conversation, she was sharing with me about her commitment to women and how she wants them to have a different relationship with their physical bodies. So Chrissy, maybe we just start there. Like, let's just start with your work with women and their bodies. And I have a feeling that'll set us on the pathway for everything else.
Absolutely. So when I think about the work that I do with women, I refer to the work I do as body liberation. I have a thing that I call the Body Liberation Project, which is ever evolving. But, the reason I talk about body liberation and relationship with body image and ourselves is because of my own personal experience. When I got into fitness, I joined the gym for the same reason a lot of people do. I just wanted to lose weight. I just wanted to be skinny. I thought of nothing else as the purpose. And so, anyways, my journey with strength is like a whole nother story that, I could share another day. But I used to think that I was just like a weak person, and I got into strength training, and then I recognized that, oh, actually, like strength is a skill like any other skill, right? And so that the physical strength that I joined the gym really transferred into other areas of my life. And I recognized like, wow, what other stories have I been telling myself, right? That I couldn't do that I actually could do. And it also helped me to reshape my relationship with my body, that like my soul's purpose in life wasn't to shrink and to be smaller, and that actually like I had a lot of value to add to the world and had nothing to do with what I look like. And I spent so many years obsessing about everything I ate and obsessing about going to, work out and not missing workouts. And when I really started to recognize, and I reached what, was my goal weight, right? Some people are like, I just want to get to this goal weight. And what I realized when I got to the goal weight is that it still wasn't enough for me. I still wanted something else. I still wanted more, a few more pounds. I want to change this. I want to change that. And so it really forced me to recognize that as long as I was, attributing my worth and value as a person to what I look like, I was never going to be happy. I'd always be on this roller coaster of the shame and obsession. And so I got to what I consider my rock bottom, and it really forced me to start to recognize and work through my own relationship with my body and body image. And through that process, which is, I'm telling you years in a few sentences, but through that process, I really did work and repair my relationship with my body image. And so when I think of body liberation, it's not about that I just look in the mirror and love everything about myself, because I also think that's an unrealistic expectation, right? But it's that I can look at myself and recognize that who I am is not what I look like. In fact, I'm so much more interesting and valuable than what I look like. And that in actuality, our bodies are just the thing that lets us have this human experience. It doesn't make us who we are. And so my goal for the clients I work with and the work that I do is to help everybody move towards that place of body liberation so that we can focus on creating our magic in the world. And our magic doesn't come from what we look like.
Yes. I mean, I relate to all of that. I feel that so deeply. One of the things that I really love about, I also do a ton of strength training. So I get
Yeah.
you're encapsulating, and I love it so much because something about being a woman in this world and getting strong in that way does something to your mind and to your thinking. I post about this all the time on my Instagram, but like when I post, weight training videos, and I'm just like, I feel like I am manifesting and tapping into and connecting with the kind of strength that is just totally necessary right now to get through stress, get through unknown, breathe when it's hard, like all the things. So it becomes this beautiful relationship between your mindset, your soul, and then what you're physically doing with, the shell, which is your body.
Absolutely. I love that. And I totally agree. And one of my favorite movements, strength training movements is because I competed in powerlifting, is deadlifting. And so it's like, that moving hundreds of pounds off the ground is just like a feeling that I don't know, I can't explain, right? It's exhilarating, it's empowering. And the thing that I'm always saying in my head is I can do hard things. And that's the same message, right? That I use outside of the gym when I'm doing other things. It's like, oh yeah, like I can do these, I can get through these challenging moments, right? I can do these difficult things because I can do hard things.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think those of us who have been on movers, for a long time, I was a yoga person. Well, I was actually a dance person for a long time, and then yoga. And then like I got into spinning after I had my first kid because I was like, oh, I got to lose the baby weight or whatever, those things are. And I find that as I've gotten older, and as life has become inherently more difficult and serious, there is something about the weight, the lifting of the weight. It's so representative. So I really love that. How do you see that work transforming your clients and the people that you're touching?
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting because I think, when I first got into fitness training, I was, years ago when I was coaching, I was still very much in the mindset of like fat loss. And so I spent a lot of time with my clients doing that. And then as I started to make my transition and I started to share my work about, body image and like body liberation, which I wasn't calling it yet that, I was just kind of whatever. But I started talking more about like how strength is just empowering and how being strong is functional and how it makes me feel better just in all areas of my life. And so then I really started to attract clients who are like, yeah, like that's what I'm searching for, right? Like all this time I thought I just wanted to be smaller. I thought I wanted to shrink, but now this is the feeling that I'm actually searching for, right? And also talking more about movement for joy, because sometimes we miss that, right? We spend so much time thinking about like fat loss and physique change and all of this. And it's like, how about moving because we want to feel strong or powerful and energized? And so I think me talking about that and showing powerlifting videos of being strong and like feeling badass really, really helped other people say, like, oh yeah, like this is a possibility for myself, right? This is something that I could strive for as well, versus just thinking about it in terms of like being smaller, or like you said, like losing the baby weight or whatever that is.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. I also love how your work it seems like it so beautifully blends the mind and the body. I mean, we know that it's one, but I think once you start really like getting into it, you start to experience it in its tangible form. I mean, like,
Yeah.
we know, like when we're having a sad day or an emotional day or a pissed off day, it's like you get with those weights and you're like, ugh.
Yes, absolutely. Something happens, right? And you can take it all out in the gym, right? And you can like take all that like frustration that you're feeling and like channel that into like, like, yeah, lifting something really heavy or just like, moving your body in ways that feel really good. And I think for me also, when I'm always thinking about wellness, like I'm not going to call it fitness, I'm thinking about wellness, right? It goes so far beyond just like exercise and nutrition, right? And when I think about my work as a practitioner and just the wellness industry in general, is that like for me the hope is that we are helping with holistic health, right? And so that means mental, physical, emotional, spiritual, all of those aspects of ourselves, because recognizing that when all of those things are intact or when we really feel well in our bodies, right, it's not just about the one thing, it is about all of the things. And so that includes mindset and how we're feeling in our mental health. And so how are we making sure that as practitioners of wellness or just people who are exercising ourselves, how are we taking care of our overall health?
Yeah, I also think that strength is such an important antidote to the level of stressors we're under, like right now, today.
Yes.
We're sitting here in the midst of a pandemic, some crazy ass politics and elections, like just, it's tough. It's, everybody has varying degrees of their own personal stressors, of course, but the basic through line is stress. And
Mhm.
I think we do all need the reminders, no matter where we are, where we sit, what we do, that we have what it takes. And sometimes we need to prove it to ourselves, right?
Absolutely. We do need to prove it to ourselves. And I think everything you're saying is so true in terms of like we all, regardless, have like our normal stressors, but we are all under collective trauma, collective grief, right? And we're thinking about, yes, the pandemic and thinking about the election and politics and thinking about race relations in the country. There's just an incredible amount of stress that we are all under. And also this is why so often I talk about the necessity of making sure the fitness, wellness, industries are really diverse and inclusive, because I think now more than ever, we all need access to fitness that feels good, that we feel safe, that we feel like accepted, celebrated, recognized, because we need to be taking care of ourselves right now more than I think ever have. And the necessity of those things in our lives are so much more important than they've been, I don't know, I don't want to say ever, but in a very long time, right? And so that we all have access to those things and that we feel like those are places that we can go and be safe is so important. And I think about, when we're not having those conversations or not ensuring that we're creating spaces that really do feel good for people, we're further possibly alienating people from activities that could really be a benefit to their overall wellness.
Yeah, 100%. So, if it's okay with you, Chrissy, I'd love to just like get personal. So, as a woman of color in the fitness and the wellness industry, obviously, I know it's funny. Like when I talk to my husband about these topics as a Black entrepreneur, he's like, this stuff, like white people are the ones who are shocked right now. Like this stuff has been going on forever. Now, of course, energy and emotion is higher because we're all sensory beings and everything is up and we're seeing things, in our face, like in a certain way, which is just traumatic in so many ways. But I'm just curious about your story. I mean, being a person who's set out in this industry with, such a passion for it and wanting to do this level of work, like what have you encountered and what did not sit right? What have you battled with?
Yeah, the reality is I think like since the June timeframe, I think George Floyd was like a really big part of that. Suddenly, yes, people have woken up, but the reality is like even with George Floyd, like nothing that happened is anything really new. These things have always been happening, right? Like there's not a new phenomenon, although a lot of people are suddenly waking up to it. But you're right, as your husband said, for BIPOC, it's like, yeah, okay, this is not a new story for us, right? So when I think about my own work in this industry around diversity and inclusion and anti-racism, like again, this is not something that I just started talking about. When I became a trainer and started coaching, and then I got into like the online space, which is almost like 5 years ago now, I wrote my first article about like the lack of diversity and inclusion in the wellness spaces back in 2016. And it was like terrifying for me to write about that because at the time it wasn't something that people in the industry were really talking about. And I remember just like being terrified to write that article, but also feeling the necessity of talking about why I wasn't seeing representation of people who look like myself and the covers of magazines. But beyond that, like even I was going to like professional events because I wanted to be an expert in the industry, and I wasn't seeing diversity on the panels or the speaker lineup. Like I just wasn't seeing it. And so that's something I started talking about way back then. And it was way less popular to talk about than it is now, right? And so there were people who were like definitely, and I think when I started talking about it, the thing that was reassuring for me was that there were lots of other people of color who were like, thank you for saying this because I've been feeling this for a long time, right? It wasn't reassurance from other fitness professionals because at that time people just didn't really want to talk about it. We were very much in a space, I think at that time, where people were like, I don't get into that stuff on my page, right? I don't talk about racism. I don't talk about politics. I remember I wrote another article right after Charlottesville happened when there was a KKK rallies, and I called out a lot of people, not by name, but I just called out the fitness industry for not having these conversations. And I remember a lot of people were like, yeah, I'm here to talk about exercise, not to talk about racism or social justice. And for me, I'm like, hey, that's not a thing that we separate because racism is a public health issue, right? There are actual physical health effects of racism, things like increased rates of blood pressure, increased rates of heart disease, increase of breast cancer, right? And then there's actual health disparities based on race, like Black women are 2 to 3 times more likely to die from pregnancy and pregnancy-related complications. So right now we're in COVID. Black people are dying at COVID at 3 times the rate of white people. So when we think about all these things, I'm like, no, but y'all, racism is a public health issue. So if we are wellness practitioners, there's no way we can't be having these conversations because you can't separate the two, right? And so, yeah, it just wasn't a popular conversation for a long time, but it wasn't something that deterred me from talking about it because, again, I have a background in social justice and social welfare. And so that has always been top of mind for me. It's like, even before I got into fitness, I worked for the federal government. I was a homeless coordinator for a lot of years. Social justice is, as long as I remember, that's always been something I'm interested in. And so it's like, for me, it was the merger of two things that are really important to me and I think completely necessary for the wellness industry to be talking about. And so then fast forward to now, and now everybody wants to talk about it, which is great, right? I'm happy that people are showing up for the conversation. I think there's still a part of me, it's bittersweet because it's unfortunate the events that led people to finally be ready to have these conversations. But I'm hopeful anyways that people are here to not just have the conversations, but actually make the difficult and necessary changes so that we do create a fitness industry and a wellness industry that's more equitable and also that is more embracing and welcoming and engaging of people from all backgrounds.
I agree with everything you just said. There's like suddenly the conversation is up. Suddenly it feels almost like no judgment because everybody needs to figure out how to get into the conversation. But at the same time, like you can tell when there's a certain degree of scrambling to be, how do I get into this conversation? How do I represent myself or my business as something or someone that cares versus, like someone like yourself. And again, I keep bringing my husband up, but like same thing. Like he's like, I've been doing this work for years. Like now are seeing me. And so, you can tell when there has already been a foundation versus like the scramble to somehow represent something.
Yeah.
What's your take on that disparity of experience with people kind of like wanting to get in, but not always knowing how or how to do it authentically?
Yeah, you're right in that you can always tell who's scrambling and who's already kind of been doing some of the work. And I think in this time period, it's been really obvious for me anyways, what people have, or it's performative in nature. There's no other way to say it, right? Like, but I think we're at this time in history where people don't want to look bad. And so they're like, oh yeah, like I'm trying to do this thing. And I think, again, it comes across very performative, particularly when you're like, and I don't know if this is something your husband experienced, but I know I personally experienced is like people grabbing for, like, I need the, like people that you've never had contact with. Like I remember in June, I was getting these requests from like so many people asking for things, people that I had never had contact with before. And at people, like, I remember people calling me like, like literally people from companies calling me like, I have an emergency situation, I need your help. And I'm like, no, I'm not coming to save you. I don't even know you, right? And so I think there's been a myriad of experiences. And then I've been fortunate to work with a lot of companies who I do think want to make, actual change. I think the thing that can feel conflicting, or at least I'm always conflicted about, is the fact that when we are talking about, anti-racism, diversity, inclusion, and particularly within larger organizations, like, people want to be able to make these quick fixes. And the reality is that none of this work is quick and it doesn't happen overnight. And particularly when we're talking about larger organizations, one of the first questions I always ask people when they're talking about wanting to have inclusion and diversity, I'm like, well, let me look at who's on your leadership team. Let me look who's in the board of directors. Because if that's all the same, if everyone's white, cisgender, whatever, then it doesn't matter what you do in the lower level, right? It has to start from the top down. And that means you have to make some difficult decisions. That means you have to act. That's the things that are going to take time, right? And so many times I think that companies want to be able to outwardly show people that they are doing the work and they have diversity and inclusion, but that to actually do that in a way that's meaningful, it doesn't happen overnight. And you have to be willing to make some sacrifices. And I think equality, there's this quote, I didn't make this up, I don't even really know who said it, but equality feels like oppression when you're used to being privileged. And so that process of equality is going to mean that things are going to change and that it's not going to be comfortable for people all the time. And it's going to take a lot of work that doesn't feel good, but that's what's required.
Yeah, two things I was going to comment on that you just said. Like, when there's been these like big like fashion houses that will release, an image on a sweater or whatever.
Yes.
Completely offensive and everyone freaks out on social media. And you think to yourself, how the hell?
How'd that happen?
How the hell did that make it all the way to market? And the answer is clear.
Yep.
There's no people of color on their board or on their
Nobody.
Design team or whatever. That's how you get stupid, insensitive shit out onto the market. Like, right. There's only
because nobody was there. Because if anybody was there, they would be like, no, we can't do this. It's a horrible idea.
Right. Stuff like that is so missed. So I totally agree with you. It has to start at the top. It has to be leadership. And then the perspectives trickle down into the organization. So yes, I'm with you. Patience with the process. Yeah. That's a really hard one. It's really hard because discomfort is not easy. And like, who wants to sit in it? Especially when, to your point, what we were chatting beforehand, I'll say it because I'm the white person in this room. Like, the white privilege piece of this whole conversation is that typically speaking, and of course there are exceptions, but typically speaking, the white experience isn't the one where like day in and day out, you have to put your armor on. And you have to like deal with consistent discomfort. Right. I'm admitting that for myself. So, the practice of being able to get uncomfortable and kind of stay in that place and kind of manage yourself as you're dealing with that, that's the work.
That is the work. And it's the work to be able to sit in that discomfort while you're because I think in this time and this day and age now too, there's like definitely a culture of accountability, right? Where people will call you out for your bullshit on social media or wherever. And so then there's also that layer of sitting in discomfort while you're also maybe being called out, right? Because maybe you did miss the mark. And so you are going to work to fix it. But again, that fix is not going to happen overnight. So that means you just have to sit with that discomfort, right? And it is hard. And again, we live in a society where whiteness is centered. And you don't have as many opportunities where you have to just be used to being uncomfortable and you get used to that feeling of discomfort. There's just not as many opportunities. And so it's hard, it's challenging.
I think I'll speak to women to start with, because I think you and I are most focused on women and on our work. But, I think that there's a certain degree of perfectionism that, as women and definitely as white women, like is sort of fixate, like put into our brains. And so there's a few layers, like it makes that ability to sit in discomfort. It makes that admittance of what you don't know, or like the fear of like speaking something out for the fear of saying it wrong or whatever. It creates all of these layers of challenge. But also then there's the whole like, but I tried. And then there was the call out. And then it becomes this cycle of, but I'm trying. And look, Chrissy, I've been there. I've written something and someone called me out who's a good friend, and it was like very, very uncomfortable. And I'm still not sure exactly like what to do to like figure that all out, except just to continue to show up and be present. But it's difficult. It's not comfortable.
Yeah. So I do a webinar. I hold a webinar for wellness professionals. It's called Anti-Racism for Wellness Professionals. And that's one of the things we get into is because inevitably you can be doing things with the best of intentions and you're just going to get it wrong. That is simply part of the process, right? There's no way around that. And I think so many times people want to avoid that and they want to wait, so they just get it just right. And I'm like, if you wait to just get it just right, you're just never going to act, right? You can have the best intentions. You will likely get it wrong. Someone will call you in and or call you out. The difference is calling in is when I'm just going to, call you on the phone and say, hey, you did this thing that was inappropriate. Calling out is when someone on social media tags you and says, hey, this person just did this messed up thing, right? So someone's going to call you in or someone's going to call you out. And in that moment, even though it's wildly uncomfortable and even though the human nature is to slip into this offensive mode, like I was trying to do the right thing, in that moment, you have to recognize like, yes, I was trying to do the right thing and I messed this up and it's part of the process, right? And it's always more important how you react in those moments than the fact that you got it wrong, right? And that's for me personally. I know people are going to get it wrong. I'm more concerned about how the response to getting it wrong is than the fact that you got it wrong, right? And so you just have to get comfortable with, and yes, it's wildly uncomfortable to be called in or called out. And I also always encourage people that if a BIPOC called you in or called you out, it wasn't comfortable for them either, right? I had a conversation with a good friend of mine who's white last week about something that was inappropriate. And I was like, shit, I hate that I have to call and have this conversation with her. However, I have to have a call and have this conversation with her, right? So I always remind people that being on the receiving end of racism is always harder than experiencing racism every day is always harder than the discomfort of being called in about your racism. And so it's like, how can we navigate those situations with compassion and care for ourselves? And I say for ourselves, meaning like if you're a white person, how can you show yourself compassion and care in that moment while also acknowledging that you messed this up and that you're committed to doing better? And that also you're going to keep showing up for the difficult conversations, even though you messed it up, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's kind of like, in the moment that I had, that was sort of where I had to go with it. I was like, okay, let me fix what could be construed a certain way. And then let me continue to show up, because the thing that would be like the fail here would be if I stopped opening up and I stopped having conversations and I decided that it wasn't mine to have, like it's everybody's to have. So yes, to your point, I would love to pick your brain a little bit about the wellness industry at large. And, you and I both honed in on that word safety. I won't name names, but there was a wellness space that I participated in the city, and it was a very special place. I loved it, had a great experience there. And it was notably not diverse in the way that it needed to be. And there was all of these efforts on the inside, and I was privy to what was going on in the inside of like, well, we're trying. And then at the end of the day, like the question becomes like, well, where is the comfort and the safe space for any person of color to feel like this belongs to them too, like a place that they actually want to show up? And that was, I think, something that couldn't quite be answered because I don't think it was like really considered again at the foundation. So I'm curious, like your perspective on dynamics like that, and like, what does it mean to create spaces of wellness that people want to actually show up and be part of?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. And I think with all the conversation that we're seeing within the wellness industry around having a diverse and inclusive industry, and I think, as much as I love the words diversity and inclusivity, I think they've become kind of overused. And I think that for a lot of people, especially BIPOC, when people are saying that, especially white people are saying that now, the people are like, oh, I don't really want to hear about it, right? Because so often there's words that aren't met back with action. And so when I'm thinking about inclusivity and what that means, I think for one, the idea that Vera Myers is a diversity and inclusion specialist, and she has this great analogy because a lot of times people also use this word diversity and inclusive interchangeably, and they're very different things. And so one of my quotes I love from her is diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. And so I think about that quote and I think about, all of us know that feeling of going to a party and you're like on the outside looking in, you're like, you're not dancing, you're kind of like a wallflower and you're watching everybody else have a good time. You feel out of place. You're looking at your watch, like, I just can't wait to get out of here. This because doesn't feel good. So you're there, right? But you don't feel a part of what's happening. And inclusion on the flip side is when someone grabs your arm and then 5 minutes later you're in the party dancing, having the time of your life. and you're like, wow, this day went so fast. This night was so fun. I can't wait to come back and do it again. And that's really the difference between diversity and inclusion. You can have a lot of people of different backgrounds in your space, but if they don't feel a part, it doesn't really matter. They're just there. And inclusion is when everybody, regardless of their background, their race, their gender, can come into this space and feel like not only do they feel included, but it was also designed with them in mind, not as an afterthought. And so I think where people miss the mark on inclusivity a lot is particularly like white-led organizations. They're thinking from the frame of like, how can we make people feel accepted here versus looking at it like, what do we need to dismantle and redesign with everyone in mind? Because we can recognize that this space probably wasn't designed with everyone in mind. And it's not just adding a little space for people to come in. It's like, no, we need to start over in some ways, right? We need to start from scratch. And we need to really be an environment that no matter who you walk in, you know that you are not an afterthought. You were thought of with the curriculum, the planning, everything in place, and that it's equally important for people to see themselves represented in fitness spaces as well. So, having instructors from a various rich backgrounds, like all those things matter and are really important. And so many times I think people are trying to work backwards. They have created the space without everyone in mind. And now they're like, how can we carve out a little space for these other people? And that's not how you ever get real inclusivity.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always had lots of respect for the companies that, like they've had a commitment from go to women
Yeah.
of all kinds, women of all sizes. I mean, I'll say it's one of the reasons why I've always been proud to work with Athleta.
Yeah.
You see women from age 4 to 100. You see all shapes and sizes, all different colors. Even the people who have been instructors in their studio in the city. We've got a woman who teaches like Caribbean dance workouts. I mean, you name it. It kind of is like bringing a little bit of everything in. And I know what it feels like to like be around that. And it's just been part of the ethos of the company versus other spaces where that it really is an afterthought. You can tell.
Yeah, you can feel that. You can feel it and it's obvious. And I think, the other unfortunate thing that I've seen just with the companies that I've worked with, the organizations that I've worked with, is that a lot of times, again, for me, when we're thinking about diversity and inclusion, the first step has to be the work of anti-racism. You can't do diversity and inclusion without doing anti-racism. And the work of anti-racism really starts with ourselves, right? That starts with us examining our own implicit bias. It starts with us examining the ways in which we are engaging in racism and being able to face that we live in an inherently racist, white supremacist country, which means that we have all engaged in white supremacy, right? And so how can we start to unlearn those things in our own lives? Because, even if you have the best of intentions, if you haven't examined your own internalized bias, implicit bias, and conscious bias, whatever everyone could call it, if you haven't done the work of anti-racism in your life, it doesn't matter how good your intentions are, you are going to be causing harm to people. And so, again, that work is really challenging work. That's not the easy stuff. But, Layla Saad has a book that I always recommend to people. It's called Me and White Supremacy. It's one of my favorite books for anyone to learn about racism, but particularly for white people who really want to work on this, start this journey of anti-racism work. And one of the quotes she says, I'm paraphrasing it, but it's just like, we have to be the change we want to see in the world. And so when we are in the fitness industry or saying we want to create a more diverse and inclusive industry, that means that individually we have to start with ourselves and do that work of anti-racism. Because once you start to do that work, you see how this is showing up in all areas of your life that maybe you haven't even thought of. And once we do that work, then we can say, okay, now let's think about these bigger systems. Now let's think about how we create diversity and inclusion, but you can't skip the steps.
That is very like going beyond for me. I'm like, everything you do in your daily life is directly connected to
Yes.
how you envision the bigger picture.
Yes.
Do you think, because, I think a lot of people, especially in these past months, have been like, okay, I'm going to like read the books, which is important. I'm going to watch the films. It's important. But do you think that people can really do this work solo?
It's an interesting question. So I actually think that it's hard for people to do the work solo without at least being in community with other people. And the reason I say that, and again, this is my perspective, but the reason I say that is I think that for white people coming to this work, when you really start to do this work, it is very disconcerting, right? It's going to mess with your perception of who you thought you were in the world. It's going to mess with your perception of a lot of things that you thought to be true when you start to recognize that they're not really true. And those can be hard feelings to face. And so what I think happens for most people is they start to have these realizations and they either withdraw because it's just too much, right? And they're like, I can't deal with this right now. And they choose to just go back to the space of like, and not knowing, right? Because when you don't know, you aren't forced with the decision that you have to make, right? Because when you really know and when you really see, you either have to decide that you are going to work to dismantle the system of white supremacy, or you're going to just say, I like the privilege that I have and I'm just going to stay with the way that things are, right? That's really the decision that you end up making. And so I think it's important and impactful to be doing this work in community with other people, because a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions are going to come up for you, right? And I think it's also important that you have people who are going to hold you accountable, right? People who are actually going to like call you out on your bullshit sometimes, right? Like I think that's a necessary part of the work. And I think that when we're thinking about the larger, because again, the goal of doing this work in our own lives is that hopefully we are all collectively working to dismantle systems of oppression in this country and dismantle white supremacy. And that has to be done collectively. That's not done individually. So I do think it's really important to be doing this work in community. And again, reading the books for yourself is important because we have to start with ourselves. But then the point of also that information is that we are having the difficult conversations with our partners and our friends and our coworkers and our children, right? So that we are changing the people around us, or bringing the people around us with us, not just so that we can individually say, I'm not one of those problematic white people, right? It's that like I can recognize these things in my life and recognize that I have a lot of ongoing work to do. And I'm going to do the work of talking to people around me because it is our job to end white supremacy.
Yeah, I also think the solo work is also, it's almost like learning a new language. It's like
Yeah.
language. So
Yes.
I noticed that like the more that I've read, the more films I've watched, the more, podcasts I've listened to on the subject, the more I have the words to express the things I may feel or think about or be curious about. And so
Right.
you have to learn the language also. So that's part of it. So like something else I want to think about, or that I do think about, I think sometimes in this work too, we can also assume that like all Black individuals or all BIPOC individuals have the exact same perspectives around this. And like, that's not true either. I feel like I've had the experience. I mean, again, the moment where I had an interaction with a friend of mine, not judging it, but I took it to my sister-in-law who had a totally different insight on it. And what that reminded me was like, it's such an obvious statement, but like, it reminded me that it is important to have many conversations and to have it with a variety of people within, because you're going to learn different things. You're going to be fed different perspectives. And then you take that to the new language you're learning and you start to come to terms with, well, then who am I in this conversation?
Yeah, it's really important. Black people are not a monolith, right?
Ridiculous to even have to say that, but
yeah, but it's true though.
Yeah.
We're not a monolith. We have varied opinions. We have different thoughts, and I say that all the time, even when I'm leading my webinars, I'm like, listen, this is my thought process. You will meet other Black people who think differently, and that's okay. We are allowed to think differently about these things, right? We are allowed to have different pathologies. We're all the pedagogies, like all these things. We're allowed to have different thoughts, and you will absolutely run into people who have different thoughts. And this is also why it's really important, I think, for white people too, and I love to say, I hope people never say this, but I know they do. I've had people say this to me, like, oh, I asked my Black friend and they said it was okay. And it's like, yeah, because that person, right? And that one person, just like I don't get to speak for all Black people, that one person also doesn't get to speak for all Black people. And we are allowed to have different thought process and views. And you will run across a myriad of BIPOC who have different thought process and all the things. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to shift gears a little bit, Chrissy. I mean, this is thank you for all of that insight. So you're doing a lot right now. You're not only working on the body liberation work, you're doing all of this anti-racist work in the wellness industry. Like you're giving a lot towards the betterment of people right now. So I want to just give you a big namaste. That's amazing.
Oh, thank you.
How are you taking care of you right now? And what are the truths that are creating stability for you and giving you breath? Because I'm certain that there's a lot there. There's a lot of weight that you're carrying.
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely found myself really burned out last month. I just been going. And it's weird because, not weird, but it's interesting because I'm excited about all the work I'm doing, right? But it is heavy in some ways, it's exhausting. And so I've been more intentional about boundaries around my work, right? And especially thinking COVID, I'm home a lot. I'm like, oh, it's okay. I can just keep working. I'm here. It's fine, whatever. And right. So trying to have better boundaries, trying to be intentional about self-care. Movement is always really important for me. So strength training I'm not going to the gym, but I have kettlebells and stuff. I do stuff at home. But even if I don't do that, just getting out and getting fresh air and walking and just creating some space and mental health care. I mean, I see my therapist. I go to Reiki all the time. That's really important to me. And especially I think this week in general, just everything with the election and just really giving myself permission to do less for one, and to take a break from social media, and to be off and be intentional about being off of social media, and to not feel like I'm in a constant space of having to educate people, and recognizing that the work is this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? And so it's important to take time to rest and then be able to re-engage so that I can stay in the work for the long term. And so that's what I'm always trying to remind myself of.
Yeah, it's funny that you just said that because I posted a video of, well, yeah, it was a video that I took during my workout on what are those bikes called? The ones where you're like moving your arms and you're spinning.
Yeah. I'm just slipping the name, but yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and it like gets your heart rate really, really up. So I posted it and then I like wrote this caption that was like, okay, guys, I think we see now that this is a marathon, not a sprint.
Right.
And so it's like, these are the movements that to me indicate like the work that we need to do for ourselves to stay in this marathon. So yeah, it's like we have to find ways to take care of ourselves. It's interesting. We're all going to have different answers to that question for ourselves, but besides my work, I'm like taking care of my 2 kids and like, oh yeah, I got a puppy. I'm like, was that the right move? Obsessed with him, but like, this is another child. So the interesting thing is that for me, I noticed in the past few weeks, like definitely a level of burnout happening. And I was like, what is it that I need? Like, is it more movement? No, because actually I really like make sure that's in the picture. It was actually just a little bit more mindless time because I would say all these months, like I have very little of it. Like even in my downtime, like I'm reading, I'm studying, I'm watching, I'm trying to better myself. And like, I realized like my brain was overloading a little bit. And so I've actually let myself do a little bit of the like getting into a show thing on Netflix, which I just don't do often, but I want to bring that up because I think this idea of being gentle with ourselves and like giving us a full cycle of everything that we're experiencing right now on this marathon, it's going to ask us to question ourselves and say, what do I need right now based on how I'm feeling, what's going on, where my body is, where my mind is, and what will give me the long-term ability to keep going.
Yes, absolutely. That's so important, necessary to do that, and to do it without guilt or shame, because we're allowed mindless time, right? Like we deserve mindless, or not even if it's whatever it is that you need, right? Whatever it is that's going to be for you, that's going to be the thing that refreshes you. Like you're allowed to do that. And I think that's, again, that's like the mindset that we have to be hustling going all the time is a byproduct of capitalism, right? And there's a wonderful account that I love to follow on Instagram, the Nat Ministry, and it's all about the fact that we are allowed rest and we are allowed to take care of ourselves, and that our productivity, our worth is not tied to our productivity, right? And so constantly reminding ourselves of those things.
Yeah, I love that. It's so true. And that so ties into, I think, the spirit with which you come to your work, Chrissy. And I really respect. It's like you're showing up for this work because you've been doing it, you know it's important, but it's like there has to be that balance to the human being involved. And I see that in you. So it's really awesome.
Oh, thank you so much.
So before we go, I just give you like the platform, whatever it is you want to share, whether it's like your hopes for what people will be thinking about right now, how you hope they'll step in. And also, of course, any ways that you want them to hang out with you and follow your work.
Yeah. So, again, with all the work that I do, when I think of the wellness industry, my hope is that, especially all the people that have showed up to these conversations in recent months, that we collectively really be engaged in going beyond just having the conversations, but into actually doing the work in meaningful ways, so that we are actually collectively changing the landscape of the fitness and wellness industries, because we can do that. And that people really be interested in making the difficult choices and sometimes what would feel like sacrifices to make that actually come to fruition, because we recognize that it takes work. And then in terms of body liberation work, we didn't talk about it too much, but I think that my goal, my hope in the work that I'm putting out into the world is that, I feel like I'm speaking to women. I speak to anyone who the message resonates with, but I just really want us all to collectively recognize that we all have so many capabilities, and we have so much stuff that we are capable of doing, and so much magic that we are capable of putting into the world. And that, diet culture and body obsession, there are tools of white supremacy that keep us distracted from doing what we're supposed to be doing in our lives. And so I encourage people to start that journey of moving towards body liberation, again, because this all ties into all the things that we're talking about. It ties into white supremacy, it ties into racism, it ties into again, creating a world that is better for all of us in the long term, right? And I know that I say these things a lot, but all of these things are systems of oppression. They're all tied. They're all interconnected. Anyways, if you like these conversations and you want some more of these deeper conversations, you can follow me on Instagram. I am Chrissy King on Instagram. My website is chrissyking.com. As I mentioned, I have anti-racism for wellness course that replay is available, and also diversity inclusion for wellness professionals. And I'll have more opportunities around body liberation work coming up too. So
I have a feeling people will be heading over. It's all so fascinating. And I'll close with the fact that I love how you very specifically coined the intertwined nature of how we view our bodies as women and these systems of oppression that affect so many. It really is a form of control. And we are here for this one life. We have work to do. Like, let's figure out how to move past and move on and do the work we're here to do.
Yes, absolutely. 100%.
Amen. Well, Chrissy, I'm really appreciative. I'm so glad the universe brought us together.
Same. This was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And listeners, thank you so much for hanging out with Chrissy and I today. I really do personally encourage you, take whatever called to you in this conversation and go deeper, because there's a lot more where this came from. So congratulations for giving yourself some self-love and some time with me, only because this conversation, this podcast represents space for you, space for wellness, space for introspection. So good on you for taking that time. Until next time, be well, take care of you, and we'll see you again soon.